That's the problem, right? And we have to untangle this confusion. So, how do we know that the minimalist position is is the right position or the official position? Now, don't. I do want to clarify something. When we say minimalist, we're not trying to minimize the papacy. We're trying to contextualize it. It's minimalist versus the maximalist. The maximalists have made this huge thing of the papacy that it doesn't exist. And so we have to call it minimalist to kind of bring it back down to reality of what it really is. So the Pope Pius IX, a year after the council, right? He was given a letter by the Swiss bishops. The Swiss bishops wrote him a letter saying, "This is how we understand Vatican I. Please tell us if we're correct or not." Right? And who would know better than Pius IX?
Yeah.
Right? He was at the council. He was the Pope that ratified everything. And so I'm going to read the letter, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
Of the Swiss bishops. And he actually approved this letter, by the way. So this is an approval by Pope Pius, and this is what he approved. He says, they say the definition of the council has not in any respect brought about a separation between the head and the members of the teaching body in the church. After the council, as before, the popes will exercise their office as doctors and chief priests, pastors in the church, without forgetting that the bishops are appointed with them by the Holy Spirit, and according to the constitution of the church, as successors of the apostles, in order that, in concert with the Pope and in subordination to the successor of the Prince of the Apostles, they may govern the church of God. As the popes did before the council, so now, after, they will continue to strengthen their brethren, the bishops, in the faith. And here's the key. So also in the government of the church, never will they undertake anything which concerns the universal church without taking the counsel and advice of the bishops. I'm going to say that one more time. Never will they undertake anything which concerns the universal church without taking the counsel and advice of the bishops. As they did before the council, so now also afterwards will the popes summon councils, ask the advice of the bishops scattered over the world, use every means in their power to obtain a full understanding respecting that deposited faith which has been confided to the church. And it goes on, but
yeah, I sent the link to your Twitter post where you posted this. If anybody
awesome.
wanted to read more about it,
Sweet, I appreciate that. Yes, this is a big deal, right? Because this is, first of all, it's bishops writing this. It's not orthobros writing this, right? And this is the bishop's understanding of Vatican I, right? And now the Pope, he approves this. He's like, yeah, that's the right understanding. This is the Pope that people think was calling this council because he was power hungry. Pope Pius IX. That's what they thought, right? That's not true. Obviously, since he wouldn't approve this if he was power hungry, he'd have no benefit approving something like this.
Yeah.
If he wanted the council to teach that he's the absolute monarch who was an autocrat, right? So now the question is, who are we going to believe? Are we going to believe our own teachers, pastors, bishops, popes, or are we going to believe the orthobros or whatever, or Protestants, or even Catholics that don't understand the teaching, right? It's very clear how you properly understand Vatican I. Now, this is just like 1% of what I present on my video. I go through the relatio of Bishop Gasser, and the relatio of Bishop Gasser is a document that the Vatican I fathers read. Well, it was really a speech by Vincent Gasser. He gave them the speech so that they understand what they're voting on when it comes to papal infallibility, right?
Yeah, that point is extremely important because a lot of people, they probably haven't heard, because you might have, somebody might have caught earlier, I said, rather than saying Gasser's relatio, I said Kloitkin's relatio about De Ecclesia. It's because relatio is a very technical phrase for an explanatory document that comes from a commission who authors the document, like the document which is to be voted on. So this is like the official from the author's explanation, which is presented to the bishops. So it's like you can't just read the relatio and say, oh, they just misunderstood it. Like those were the guys who wrote it. Like all the bishops, when they voted on it, this is what they had in mind. It's like completely ridiculous to read the relatio and say, oh no, he just misunderstood it.
Yes. And it's looked at as the official interpretation of Vatican I, the relatio, right? And I go through in my like 10-hour series, I go through like almost the whole thing, line by line, right? But in my 2-hour, almost 2.5, 3-hour video that I did recently, I condensed the important parts of the relatio. So the relatio, it actually addresses a lot of the stuff that we're discussing today online. The all like, can the Pope act alone? Is the Pope an autocrat? Can the Pope go against the consent of the Church? It literally addresses these things, and it says no, he cannot go against the consent of the Church. In fact, there is a part in here that says the it'll first ask the question. It gives an axiom. Says this axiom is the members should be joined to the head and the head to the members. That's the axiom, right? Here's the argument. From this axiom, they deduce that it is necessary for the Pope in defining dogma of faith to do nothing without the advice and consent of his brothers. So this is Gasser's relatio, right? He says, before I reply to this objection, it will be helpful to remember that in this opinion of the adversaries, we are dealing with a strict and absolute necessity of episcopal advice and help in every dogmatic judgment of the Roman Pontiff, so much so that it must have its place in the very definition of our dogmatic constitution. So in other words, we're dealing with these folks who want this to be in the actual definition, right? So this is what he's not saying that the Pope doesn't need the consent of the Church. He's saying we're dealing with whether we should put this in the actual dogma of the definition. He says it is in this strict and absolute necessity that the whole difference between us consists. Because that's the only difference, is you want it in the dogma, we don't. It's not that we disagree with you. We believe that what you're saying is true. The Pope does need the consent. And then he goes on, he says, the difference does not consist in the opportunist or some relative necessity, which must be completely left to the judgment of the Roman Pontiff as he determines according to the circumstances. As such, this type of, he calls it necessity, cannot have a place in the definition of a dogmatic constitution. Now, here's the key. This line right here is the key. But this issue is pressed by saying, and this is the third axiom, the consent of the churches is a rule of faith which even the Pope ought to follow. So now he sets up another axiom. This axiom is that the consent of the churches is a rule of faith for popes to follow, right? And he says, and therefore he should consult those who rule the churches before he makes a definition in order that he may be certain about the consent of the churches. Now he says, I reply. So he's going to respond to this. He says, the matter has come to its extreme point, and we must accurately distinguish between true and false, lest we suffer shipwreck in port. He says, it is true that the Pope in his definitions ex cathedra has the same sources which the church has, scripture and tradition. And here's the key. Now he's responding here in this next line to that axiom of the consent of the church is a rule of faith to the popes. He says, it is true, so he's agreeing with them, that the consent of the present preaching of the whole magisterium of the church, united with its head, is a rule of faith even for pontifical definitions. So he gives them that. He goes, you guys are right. It is true that the Pope does need the consent of the church, contrary to what people think Vatican I is teaching, which is he does not need the consent. But here, consent, he's talking about agreement, the faith of the church. Vatican I, when it says does not need the consent, it's talking about permission, specifically to say that consent does not make something infallible. That's all they're talking about, right? And now he says, but from all this, it can no way be deduced that there is a strict and absolute necessity of seeking that consent from the rulers of the church or from the bishops. So it doesn't have to be a strict and absolute necessity to seek that consent. But he says, why? I say this because this consent, again, consent, so he still needs consent. He's not saying he doesn't need consent. This consent is very frequently able to be deduced from the clear and manifest testimonies of sacred scripture, from the consent of antiquity, that is of the Holy Fathers, from the opinion of theologians, and from other private means, all of which suffice for full information about the fact of the church's consent. So again, church's consent is a necessity. It's not a option, right? Now, I'll give you an example, and this actually has happened recently in the Catholic Church, where the Pope did something without getting the consent of the bishops or the agreement. And the reason why he did it without them is because he already knew what they believed about this. So this is Pope St. John Paul II. And you're going to have to help me out because you know Latin better than me. The document on female ordination.
Oh, I can't remember the name of the doctrinal
Sakura,
seminars.
Sakura something, something. Okay, so when he decreed about whether females can be ordained or not, right? He did not go and poll the bishops on that. And this is what
Mm.
Gasser's talking about. It would be kind of stupid to do that. In 2,000 years of history, we never had a single female
Oh
ordained.
yeah, ordinatio sacerdotalis.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. So he actually decreed, and this is not papal magisterium. This is actually the ordinary magisterium of the church, universal ordinary magisterium. So it wasn't a papal infallibility or an ex cathedra. I'm just giving this example to help understand what Gasser is talking about. So when the Pope knows a teaching is obvious, like what the bishops believe on female ordination, he doesn't need to go and pull them on it. It's
Mm.
obvious. So he can decree the consent of the church. He already has the consent behind it because that's what the church has always taught, right? Where he may go and ask the bishops for their belief on something is if there is a controversy in the church, or if there's a confusion, or if he just wants to make sure, even if he's like fairly certain, like the Immaculate Conception, the Assumption of Mary, he's fairly
Mm.
certain, right? But he just wants to involve the bishops, wants to make sure. And those two, Immaculate Conception and the Assumption, those are actual ex cathedra. So they are extraordinary papal magisterium decrees, right? So
Mm.
those are actually dogmas. The female ordination one is not an ex cathedra, but I give that example to show an example of the Pope having the consent without seeking a consent because he already has it.
Yeah,
And that, yeah,
there's actually some pretty interesting statements. For example, in the explanation of the Professio, the CDF, Ratzinger, as head of the CDF, he talks about how there's basically, obviously, a bunch of different teachings which are universally taught by the bishops, or we can even get it from the universal consent of theologians, fathers, whatever. We have these teachings, and there's a way in which the Pope can simply communicate the fact that this is the case without actually having to add his own authority. So the Pope can do a fact finding thing. Like he could have done this, let's say in Ineffabilis Deus. By the time of Ineffabilis Deus, the Immaculate Conception was confessed by all the bishops, all the Catholic theologians during that time.
yeah,
So he could have just said, "Well, this is the faith of the church. I don't really need to do anything." But there's an added degree of splendor and an added degree of solemnity with the Pope adding a sort of such a public definition of something which is already contained in the ordinary and universal magisterium.
sure,
But yeah, that's it's kind of the post Vatican II style. This is more of a stylistic change,
yeah,
where the popes more often than not, what they do now is they kind of just point to cases where what they kind of do is they kind of point to the fact that this is something universally taught, and they don't really add a definition on it because they don't need to. And some theologians have been reprimanded because they will try to use that fact in order to say, "Oh, it's not technically defined."
yeah,
But the CDF has responded on a number of occasions, said, "Okay, well, that doesn't really matter whether
yeah,
it's defined or not
right.
because you can have something which is undefined and still de fide."
Like contraception, like this same idea,
Yeah.
right? Pope and the Pope, which is another thing that folks think that the Pope did by himself, and what folks don't realize is that question was actually brought up at Vatican II.
Hmm.
Question of contraception, and over 95% of bishops said no contraception. Contraception
Hmm.
is sinful. And the Pope actually, remember how, I don't know if you know this, but he actually had a committee that he
Yeah.
appointed. The committee studied the question, and they came back to him. The whole world thought he was going to say contraception is okay. And he went against the world and said, no, it's not okay. And people thought, oh, he's just acted alone there. But he didn't, because the bishops at Vatican II had already voted on this. They just didn't make it a dogma. They didn't actually
Hmm.
release that vote as a decree. He took it upon himself to decree it from the document of course, I can't remember the name now, of where he went against contraception. Pope Paul the Sixth. What was the document called?
Humani Vitae.
Humana Vitae. What's wrong with me? Yeah, so Humana Vitae. He actually released that document under his authority. But again, that was the same thing as what you're talking about, right? Like everybody believes this, and he's just going to make it known that that's what everyone believes, and he
Hmm.
made it into a teaching, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is this is kind of there's also a misunderstanding when it comes to papal style, which we can talk about first millennium versus second millennium, because you definitely know a lot more than I do about this. But like even in the last century and a half, you look at the way, for example, that Blessed Pius IX related to civil governments around the world. I mean, Blessed Pius IX, he was the prisoner pope. He refused to acknowledge anything, and he
Yeah.
locked himself in the Vatican. Said, "Hey, you don't think I own the papal states? Well, you can go, and I will tell everyone they can't vote anymore."
Yeah.
That's what Blessed Pius IX did, and then Leo the 13th, he thought it would be more fruitful, and he acted in a different way, where he was very excited actually to be involved in international affairs. And then there's a different way in which Benedict the 15th acted from Venerable Pius XII, and he acted differently from St. John the 23rd. But there are different papal styles when it comes to their mode of teaching, when it comes to the way in which they interact with the world. But really, there is a sort of substratum which underlies everything. Like, just in the same way that we wouldn't say that Catholic teaching on the episcopacy is different just because two bishops act differently, so also when it comes to two popes acting differently, we wouldn't say that the dogma of the papacy is somehow denied by one and affirmed by the other.
Sure.
So, what are the ways in which we actually see this papal minimalism playing out in the early church?
So I'm glad you asked that question, because I'm going to tell you, first of all, why I think the Eastern Orthobros don't want to debate this topic before I answer that question. And it's going to answer the question as well. So the debate between East and West historically has been, the East says, well, show me. And when I say East and West, I'm about online apologetics, right? The last 20 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
The online ortho bros or whatever, they'll ask the papists, or the Roman Catholics, as they like to call us, they'll ask us, show me an instant in history where the Pope acted alone, right? Show me where that happened, because that's what Vatican I teaches, apparently. And the Catholic will start looking at the early church and say, well, Pope Leo acted alone. Pope Leo's tome, he's in the early church, when he wrote a tome on the Christology, Christ has two natures, that was him acting alone. And then they'll say, well, no, it wasn't, because they held a council and they judged the tome and they voted on it, and so it was a collegial thing. And so you can't use Pope Leo to say that that's an instance of the Pope acting alone. Like, okay, Pope Celestine, he acted alone when he excommunicated Nestorius. He gave him 10 days. And they'll say, no, he didn't act alone, because there was letters that say that that Pope Celestine's stance had the backing of the whole church behind it, from Alexandria and other parts of the world. So he wasn't alone in that. Other bishops and patriarchs agreed with him, and so he didn't act alone. So, and the reason why I bring this up is, when you understand the papacy in the sense that I'm presenting it here in the official teaching of the church, that it's not a pope who is an autocrat, who goes against the consent of the church, who acts alone and commands you to say okay with whatever he puts forward. When you understand it in the contextualized manner of the Pope and the bishops acting together, right? And it's the Pope's consent being a necessity for something to be universally dogmatic. That's what Vatican I is talking about. That the Pope, you cannot do anything without the Pope. The Pope has to have you have to have the consent of the Pope in order for something to have dogmatic relevance, that you can actually release it as a dogma. So now, the refutation that they bring up, if you understand the papacy in the right understanding and proper understanding of collegiality, the refutation, the very refutation they actually bring up to refute the papacy, becomes the actual proof of the papacy now. So now you got all the church history in the first millennium where the popes acted collegially, the proper way to act. That's how you're supposed to act. If they're not acting collegially, they're actually acting imprudently, because the Pope usually will involve the bishops in the decision making that has to do with the Church Universal dogmas, right? There's never been a time where the Pope declared a dogma without looking at the bishops, ever. That's never happened in the first or second millennium. So when we bring up the popes saying the Pope Leo brought forth his tome and it was voted on at the council and it was a collegial act, that's Vatican I. When you have Pope Agatho's letter that was received at the council, That's Vatican I. When you have Pope Celestine, who excommunicates Nestorius and says, you have 10 days to repent or I'm going to excommunicate you. And he has the backing of the church behind his act, even though the act itself solemnly just has Pope Celestine behind it, the actual act. But the belief of the act and what's behind it is the whole church against Nestorius. That's Vatican I. So now the very thing that they're contextualizing to disprove Vatican I is the very thing that actually proves Vatican I.